will go ahead and get started. I hope my computer does not run out of juice on me. I thought I was able to get my power cord hooked up, but it's not able to. So welcome everyone. It's good to see everyone's faces and familiar faces again as well. I hope everyone is doing okay and staying safe. Here at Holly Hall, we have actually some staff and residents have gotten their second dose of the vaccine. I am one of them, so I feel actually fine today. I got my second dose yesterday. Yeah, my arm's a little sore, but other than that, I feel 100%. But my mind is telling me I'm 100%, but my body's kind of telling me you might be a little tired, but I'm making it through. Whatever your opinion is on the vaccine, I would recommend getting it. It's, you hear all the stories and news reports. Everyone is different, so everybody's going to have a different reaction. Some people here have had a sore arm. Some people feel a little feverish, a little chill, but it's for the greater good. And hopefully this will get us back to normalcy, whatever that new normal is going to be, hopefully here really soon. So with that said, I want to thank everyone for joining in today for our Tuesday talk, first one of 2021. Can you believe it? Thank goodness we got rid of 2020. So today's topic is going to be Preservation Houston, History and Progress. So we're going to learn about the city of Houston. So I'm super excited about this, and I hope everyone is too. Our presenter for today is Mr. Jim Parsons with Preservation Houston. He is their programs director. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Parsons, and he'll do a little intro, and we'll get started.
All right. Well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks everybody for taking time out of your day to join me. I wish we could do this in person, but given the circumstances, I'm glad we're not doing it in person. But once we all get our 2 doses of vaccine, maybe Jeff will invite me back, and we can do an in-person talk. I can come up with something else to talk about. I am happy to be here today to talk a little bit about Preservation Houston, and what I want to do is to tell you really briefly about our organization, but more of the time is going to be spent on a quick history of Houston, talking about how Houston came to have historic preservation and some of the historic preservation projects that are happening in the city today. Now, if you've been in Houston for a long time, or if you've been in Houston for a month, you know that this is not a preservation-minded city. Houston is a city where I feel like every time I drive down Westheimer, they have torn everything on the street down and rebuilt the entire place. So, it's a city that's always changing, and that's always been the case with Houston. But there is a rich history here and an architectural heritage here, and that's part of what our organization is trying to preserve. Just a little bit about my background. I've been on the staff at Preservation Houston now for 11 years. I actually come from a journalism background, not a preservation background, but I'm one of those strange people who likes to do research. So it's a good match, but I've always been interested in history and architecture, and actually started out with Preservation Houston as a walking tour docent, actually 20 years ago this year. So it's an organization that I really believe in and gave a lot of volunteer time to before they started paying me to do it. So I guess that means that I'm committed or something. I don't know what that means, but we'll get started here. I'm gonna just share my screen so that you can see some photos that I wanted to show you. I should say, if you're online and are curious about some of our work and what Preservation Houston is and does, you can always visit our website, preservationhouston.org. And there's a lot more there than I would have time to tell you today. So briefly to talk about us, we're an independent nonprofit organization. We're not part of the city, the county, or the state, but we work with historical agencies at all those levels to basically make it easier for people in Houston to do preservation if that's what they want to do. We work with historic neighborhoods, some of which have organized into historic districts, which means that the historic buildings are protected. Let me just make sure you can still hear me. Okay. Zoom is, can everybody still hear me? Okay, good. Zoom is acting up. So a couple of historic districts here, Norhill on the left and Main Street Market Square on the right. You may not realize Houston actually has 22 historic districts, and we've played a part in getting several of those designated. And as a result of those historic districts being designated, some of our older neighborhoods have really had a revival in recent years. Market Square there on the left, which in non-COVID times is really hopping with restaurants and bars and hotels and new residents. On the right is a shotgun home from the 6th Ward, one of Houston's oldest residential neighborhoods, which was actually one of our early areas of focus when Preservation Houston was organized back in the late 1970s. In addition to historic districts, we work with property owners who want to landmark significant buildings and homes, which include the Dunbar Chambers Chapel there at Holly Hall, a beautiful building from the late 1950s that we were really happy to work with our partners at Houston Mod to produce a designation for. So this building is landmarked, which not only recognizes its historical and architectural significance, but also protects it going forward. And in Houston, that's really what we are focused on, is trying to protect these buildings from ourselves, who are so eager to tear them down sometimes. We do have, we're a membership organization, and we have a active and growing membership that includes a young people's group, Pier and Beam. I'm showing you a picture here because their activities look a lot more fun than most of ours, because Pier and Beam has figured out that they can learn about history and drink at the same time, which, I mean, anybody can do. They've just perfected it. But they do make sure that all their activities have an educational component. Here, it looks like they're just having a happy hour, but they're actually learning about the history of ice houses from German settlers in Texas down to the present day. And one of the Pier and Beam members is actually writing a book on Texas ice houses. So they definitely have the good life down. I mentioned our walking tours earlier, and our walking tours are a project that's near and dear to my heart. They've actually been going on since 1979, and we find walking tours are a great way to get Houstonians out to recognize the history and architecture around them. We're not a walking city, and anytime you get out and walk an area that you usually drive, you see all sorts of things that you've never seen before. I like this picture because this is actually one of our earliest walking tours in Market Square back in about 1979. If you've been in Houston long enough, you may remember when Market Square was like this, not a place that you would really want to go walk around unless you were into a certain kind of business. But these architecture fans went down there to see what historic buildings there were. And of course, the neighborhood has really spiffed up a lot since then. So with all that said, I want to get into Houston history and talk about kind of a little bit about how Houston developed and how we developed an appreciation for our past. The city, of course, was founded in 1836. This map shows the original town site of Houston. This was what it was back in the early days. It's Buffalo Bayou at the top. Main Street runs north to south down the center of this map. And right at the corner of Main and Texas, which is at the bottom center, is where the Rice Hotel stands today. So that was, in the first draft of Houston, that was as far south as the city went. You've probably heard about the Allen brothers, the founders of Houston. Augustus Allen on the left and John Kirby Allen on the right, two real estate speculators from New York who came to Texas in the early 1830s, looking basically to get into land deals here. When the Texas Revolution broke out, the Allen brothers figured that Texas would win its independence from Mexico and that it would need a new capital city, and they figured that they should be the ones to build it. And that's how Houston came to be. There is a third person who was involved in Houston's founding who did not get credit for a long time, but is getting more recognition lately, and that's Charlotte Allen on the far left. She was married to Augustus, also came down from upstate New York, and Charlotte, there are varying stories about Charlotte's involvement in early Houston. One of the popular urban legends, I guess you'd say, is that she actually bankrolled the Allen brothers' operations in Texas. there are historians who I trust who think that that's not true. What we do know about Charlotte, though, is she was here basically from the beginning, and she and Augustus ended up separating in 1850. They didn't divorce because you didn't divorce back then, but they split up. He left town and never came back, and Charlotte ended up kind of inheriting all of Augustus's business ventures, and she became probably Houston's first powerful businesswoman. She owned real estate. She developed neighborhoods. She bought and sold the block, in fact, where the Rice Hotel is. She had her own slaughterhouse. She had her own cattle brand. She was really an interesting woman who, as I mentioned, there's kind of an increasing interest in these days because we're going back and giving women their due in history, where for so many years we just sort of pretended that the men did everything. So I'm really happy to see that Charlotte's getting some recognition here. She's been called on and off through the city's history the Mother of Houston, and I think that's a good nickname for her. One thing that's ascribed to Charlotte, she gets credit for naming the city Houston after Sam Houston, the hero of the Texas Revolution. I don't know if Charlotte actually did that, but I'm happy to give her credit for it because it was a brilliant move. Naming Houston Houston was like naming Washington Washington, because Sam Houston was the man of the hour in early Texas. And Sam Houston also had a huge ego. So if you named anything after him, he was going to promote it. And that's what he did with the new city of Houston. The city that was built back in those days was pretty primitive by our standards. This is a drawing that was done by a woman named Mary Austin Holly, who visited Houston in December of 1837. She was a cousin of Stephen F. Austin's, and there was no photography back then, so she drew in her diary pictures of what she saw. And what she's drawn here was the Texas Capitol building at the corner of Main and Texas. It's the big two-story building there. It looks like a house, but every building in early Houston looked like a house because that was basically all they could do. The little building in the foreground, which also looks like a house, actually was the first government office building. It was the General Land Office, located right across Main Street from the Capitol. A few years later, we did get photography, and what you see in early pictures of at least residential neighborhoods in Houston is versions of what Mary Austin Holly drew. So on the right, you can see a picture of some houses that look a lot like the little General Land Office that she drew. In the background of that photo is what appears to be the Capitol, but it's actually just a big house that looks like the Capitol because every building more or less looked the same. This picture on the bottom is one of my favorites. It's the earliest known photo of Houston. So the picture on the top was taken about 1860. The picture on the bottom is 1856, and it's Main Street right in the heart of what was then downtown. The photographer, I think, is standing at about Main and Preston and looking back toward Allen's Landing. So what you see is a lot of 2- and 3-story wooden buildings. None of these have survived through the years. They were either torn down for bigger buildings or burned down or fell over or were destroyed in hurricanes or whatever. But we don't have really anything from this very first generation of Houston buildings. What we do have are some buildings, I guess, from the second generation when we started building with more permanent materials like brick. So the P-Lot building here at Fannin and Congress, right across from the county courthouse, is going to be one of the earliest examples of what downtown Houston used to look like. Now, this is a pretty standard Southern commercial building from the Victorian era, built about 1858. If you go to Galveston or New Orleans or Savannah, you'll see a lot of other buildings that look like this because it was just what they were building. But as a reminder of Houston's past, it's really important. And we will come back to the P-Lot building in a second because there's more to the story than just that. Through the 19th century, Houston continued to grow based on our port and the railroads that we were building out from the city. We became a lumber center and a cotton center. And this shows you kind of how Houston had expanded through the 1800s. This is a bird's eye view drawing from 1891, looking south over the city, and you can see how it just kind of spreads out in the distance. Now, one thing to remember here, the scale is just completely different from the scale of modern Houston. If you look way off in the distance in this drawing, where the city kind of plays out in prairie, That's right about where the Pierce Elevated runs along the southern edge of downtown today. So what they considered all of Houston is more or less what we would consider downtown. So it's a matter of Houston has grown by leaps and bounds over the years. After oil was discovered, Houston got more crowded and more wealthy, and we started looking like a real city that we would recognize with streetcars, crowds on the street. This is a view of Main Street about 1915. If you look on the far left, you can see an early home of Foley's department store. This is when we get into an era where not only would we tend to be impressed by the buildings they were building, but a good number of these buildings actually survive today. One that I wish survived was the City Hall and Public Market on Market Square. There had been a series of these buildings on the site since 1841. This one was the very last one, built in 1904, and a really great building that the city abandoned in 1939 when our current City Hall was built. It was actually converted to a bus station at that time. And what was left of the building burned down in 1960, which is why it doesn't exist. But just to give you an idea of some of the things that we built in the past that there's really no trace or memory of today. If you go to Market Square today, there's no sign of the actual building, but the current park design does have a granite outline that shows you where the foundations of the building were. So you can sort of get a sense of how the building sat within the square, which I think is kind of a neat nod to history. By the 1920s, we were really getting a skyline that would be impressive. You can see the Niels Esperson building under construction on the left. Main Street in the middle of the photo is clogged with cars and probably streetcars again. I wanted to show you this picture not only because I think it's a great picture, but again, to give you an impression of the scale. This is downtown where we're getting real skyscrapers and traffic. But if you went a couple of miles out, this is what Houston looked like. This is the entrance to Herman Park. On the left, you can see the Sam Houston statue. There's Main Street headed off in the distance in the center. Herman Hospital is kind of on the horizon in the middle of the picture, off by itself in the trees. So you got out to about Rice University and civilization just stopped and Main Street just kind of ran off into the woods. But again, it just gives you a sense of how small by our standards Houston was. What changed that was freeways. After World War II, we started building these freeways, which enabled people to move out of the old city and move into new suburbs. This view at the top is construction of the Southwest Freeway through kind of the Montrose and Museum District area, where they've cleared a couple of blocks of houses for as far as the eye can see. You may not be able to read that sign, but the sign says, progress necessitates inconvenience. Please bear with us, which is like the understatement of the century. We love freeways, and we just kept building them and got our current freeway system through the 1950s, 60s, 70s. It enabled people, like I said, to move to these fancy new neighborhoods where you could have a new house with a big yard. Your kids could go to a new school. You could shop at the mall in your neighborhood. You could commute to your office downtown. It was a great lifestyle, but what it meant for our older neighborhoods was they were neglected. Now, I don't mean to say that this house that I'm showing you here fell into decline because of the freeways, but it's kind of emblematic of what happened. This is a house that was on Franklin Avenue downtown in a neighborhood called Quality Hill, which there's really no trace of today. But Quality Hill was a fashionable Victorian neighborhood. You can tell this had been a nice house at one time, but it had fallen into decline here. There's a fruit stand in the yard. I think it had probably been divided up into apartments, hadn't been painted in about 150 years. Nobody wanted to live in this kind of house anymore when you could live in a new air-conditioned ranch house out in the suburbs. So you saw these old neighborhoods fall into decline. Houses like this would have been torn down pretty quickly for parking lots or an office building or a gas station. This particular house actually sits underneath what's now Minute Maid Park downtown. So that's a whole other story. It was during this time that preservation started in Houston through the efforts of a group that came to be known as the Heritage Society. They focused first on this house, the Kellum Noble House, which was built in 1847 and is the oldest building in Houston still standing on its original site. It's downtown in Sam Houston Park now, but when it was built in 1847, it was out in the country, outside of town. The city of Houston had owned it since the late 1800s. And by the early 50s, they decided it was probably time to tear it down because it had outlived its usefulness. But a group of ladies who were determined not to lose this bit of our history went to the city and actually convinced them not to knock it down, but instead to renovate it and fix it up. And so we have Houston's oldest building still with us, thanks to that determined group of women. One of their next projects was the Nichols Rice Cherry House, which they rescued from demolition in the Montrose area. It had actually started out downtown in 1850, moved to Montrose to escape demolition, and then it had to move back downtown to escape demolition again. But these two houses became the nucleus of the Heritage Society's collection at Sam Houston Park, which now has, I think, a little over a dozen historic homes and buildings. So they're mostly not on their original sites, but at least we have them as reminders of where we came from. Preservation Houston came out of the Heritage Society. We wanted to take what they were doing at Sam Houston Park and expand it all over the city. And one of our early focuses was the Market Square area because it was in really bad shape at that time in the late 1970s. This is a group of our early members standing in front of a building that was endangered, that had actually had a fire, but it was a building that dated from before the Civil War that we were really concerned about losing. The sad story is we did end up losing it. This is it on the right, being knocked down not too long after this picture was taken. But the good news that came out of these demolitions was we would lose a building and then might be able to save two. So working with our members and with property owners and developers, the two buildings that were next to that building I just showed you were able to be restored. And this is more or less how they look today. The one on the left now has a restaurant in it called Hearsay, so it's a little more active than in this picture, but two beautiful reminders of our history. Unfortunately, the one on the far left is gone. Back to the Pilat building, that was another of our early focuses because Harris County owned this building and was not really taking good care of it. They announced plans to demolish it, and we opposed those plans. It kind of went back and forth. The building was very neglected, and work eventually started to fix it up, and the building fell over because that's what happens when you neglect a building for too long. The county then said, well, the building fell over, what can you do? But we worked with the county government and with a private developer to actually put the building back together. So what you see here is a reconstruction from about 1990 of the way the building looked in 1858 when it was built, using as many original materials as could be salvaged from the pile of rubble that was the building. But I think it's pretty great. People will say, well, it's not the original. It's not the original, but it's as close as we get. And we came very close to losing it altogether. Just for some perspective, the picture on the left is what it looked like before it fell over. So it's definitely an improvement, even if it did have to fall down and be put back together. I wanted to show you some restoration projects and preservation projects that have happened in recent years, because that's the thing. It's easy to lose sight of the fact that preservation is happening all over the city, and there's some really wonderful stuff going on. And this is part of what gets me excited about the job that I do is being able to see projects like this. Again, Preservation Houston doesn't own any property. We don't actually go out and fix these buildings up, but we do what we can to facilitate people fixing them up. And then we honor outstanding preservation projects with what's called the Good Brick Awards, which the projects I'm going to show you here have all won Good Brick Awards. This bungalow is in the Westmoreland neighborhood in the Montrose area, built about 1903, actually from a book of house patterns that they used to sell. You probably have heard about Sears kit houses, where you could order all the materials you needed to build a house from Sears, and they would ship it to you by train. These pattern books were slightly different. You bought your architectural plans from a catalog, and then you could have your materials cut to match the architectural plans, and you could build a house. So it was a way in an era before, big residential developers, and when an average person might not be able to afford an architect, they could still buy an architect designed house plan and have it built. So this house was one of those. It had been converted to apartments over the years and was owned by a landlord who was out of town. So the landlord had allowed it to fall into disrepair. Everybody in the neighborhood loved it and really wanted to see it brought back. And finally, a few years ago, the house changed hands, and the new owners were determined to take it back to what it had been. Now, there were a couple of big problems with this house. One problem was the foundation was shot. Apparently, years and years ago, the foundation went. And so if you look at that picture on the left, it's the porch. The porch decking had been removed, but look at the porch columns and look at all the different angles that they're sitting at. That's not supposed to happen. So the house was essentially kind of caving in on itself. On the right, you can see a view of the front room with water damage. Some of the original fixtures had disappeared over the years, but the bones of the house were there. And so the new owners started by redoing the foundation, of course, and then went through and conserved everything that they could that was original to the house and introduced new fixtures and things where they had to. So you see these pictures of the porch in the front room before. Here's the same views after, which I think is just gorgeous. You'll notice that all the columns are in a straight line, which is a plus, but on the right, they've preserved the original woodwork, that original fireplace. There's new light fixtures that are period appropriate, but really a nice transformation there. And then here's the outside of the house. One of my favorite things here, they actually went back and did a paint analysis, dug through all the layers of paint and discovered what the original 1903 paint colors had been. So that's what you see on the house today. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Milby High School out in the East End. Milby was one of the prides of our local school system when it was built in 1926. It was an up-to-date modern high school for the East End and remained the big East End high school for years and years and years. That original building got added onto and added onto and added onto. So it was kind of this sprawling complex with this 1926 building at its heart. And the building was, used all that time and renovated, and air conditioning was added and fluorescent lighting was added and all that. So it really, served its purpose. A few years ago, there was a big school district bond issue passed to rebuild campuses, and Milby was flagged as one of those campuses. And, when the architects came in, they said, well, we could tear down this old building. And the alumni and the students of Milby said, no, this building is really important to us because this building has always been here and this has always been the heart of the campus. So we want it to be saved. So that's exactly what they did. They knocked down all of the additions to it, but saved this 1926 building as the heart of a new campus. The classrooms were updated with modern technology. They uncovered windows that had been covered up years ago, so the rooms are all flooded with natural light, which is really wonderful. A couple of interesting things they did to reclaim some original space. That picture on the left was originally an open, like light well or courtyard in the center of the building. They roofed over it and made it part of the library. So it's a way to kind of grab some space that had not been used in years and years and turned outdoor space into interior space. On the right is the remnants of the original auditorium. Now, the auditorium had moved to a new building at some point, and the old auditorium had basically been ripped out and had been converted into classrooms and offices and storage space. So they just cleared all that out. What you see there is the concrete framework that supports the auditorium, but it's now the cafeteria. So they have a state-of-the-art auditorium elsewhere on the campus in another new building, but this space has kind of returned to be the center of the historic building. And the balcony here was uncovered. So the balcony had been floored over and sealed off, and now it's kind of a gathering space where students can hang out and overlook the cafeteria. The wood accents that you see there were reclaimed from a basketball court that was taken out elsewhere on the campus. And so now the wood from the basketball court kind of makes these seats that you can sit on, which I think is pretty great. And here's what the historic building looks like today. Now, not every preservation project is necessarily what we would think of as an old house. I think sometimes when you say preservation, you think of a Victorian home with, doilies and things like that, which is great, but there's modern preservation too. This little house is in the Ayrshire neighborhood off, let's see, what would that be? Bel Air and Buffalo Speedway or Stella Link, I guess. It was built in 1953. It was named as one of Good Housekeeping's 10 best small houses of 1954. it had not gotten as run down as some of the other properties that I've shown you, but new owners came in and really wanted to put the shine back on it and take it back to the way that it looked in 1953. So this is what they did. They just reversed some kind of insensitive changes to it, repaired original materials. And one thing that I really like, in this 1954 picture, you'll see that green car under the carport. This is not the same car, but it just turns out the new owners had a car that was really similar to the car that was parked there 60 years ago. Inside, the new owners are really devoted to the mid-century modern style. So they furnish the house with antiques and with new pieces that are done in that style. It's all modern technology. So there is a big screen TV in that console that you see on the far wall, but they didn't want to have it out because they didn't want to ruin the 1953 look. That extends all over the house. The kitchen, the bathrooms are all up to date with fixtures and plumbing and that kind of thing, but all in keeping with that 1953 look. And it's just a gorgeous place. You've probably seen other houses that are similar to this in other neighborhoods because Houston really went all in for this mid-century style. Now, moving over to the Fifth Ward, I think this is a really great project as well. The Deluxe Movie Theater was one of the neighborhood theaters that used to dot Houston's neighborhoods. This one was built in the early 1940s and operated through the 60s. It's on Lyons Avenue, not too far east of the East Tex Freeway. You know, like a lot of neighborhood movie theaters, it closed and fell into decline when newer, bigger suburban theaters opened. The Deluxe did have a little bit of a reprieve in the early 70s when the Menil Foundation bought it and fixed it up to be a contemporary art gallery to try to introduce art to the children of the Fifth Ward. So this is a picture of the crew that would go on to clean up the theater and fix it up. The guy second from right wearing the striped pants is Mickey Leland, our congressman. So they fixed it up. The Deluxe operated as an art gallery for a while, and then that closed and the building went back into decline. And it got to a point where there was hardly anything left. There was the outside walls, but the auditorium had pretty much completely collapsed over the years. And the building was close to being lost. But the Fifth Ward Community Redevelopment Corporation did not want to lose it. So they worked with the city of Houston to purchase the building and refurbish it. Again, I mean, you really couldn't do much with this interior, but what they decided to do was refurbish the outside walls and build a new, completely modern theater inside those walls. So this is the auditorium that they built. It's got a fully equipped stage. It's got seating for about 150 or 200 people. They actually took in a building next door that was an old furniture store and turned it into dressing rooms and rehearsal space and kind of back of house functions. So it's got this state-of-the-art theater inside, but then the Lyons Avenue facade was taken back to the way it looked in the early 1940s, which I think is just gorgeous. I'm a sucker for historic theater, so I'm always happy to see when one is put back to use. And then finally, a room that everybody will know, Mission Control at the Johnson Space Center. Mission Control, of course, is where they controlled manned space flight in the 1960s. The Apollo missions were controlled here, including Apollo 11. The room, you know, was used for many years, actually used up through the space shuttle era. And then a new mission control room was built, and this one became just kind of a historical relic. So if you've taken a tour of NASA, you probably have been through here, but over the years, it just kind of became a shell of what it had been. The consoles were there, but they didn't work. There was some original furniture. Everything was kind of, you know, a little bit dirty and lackluster. Still cool to go in. But for the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, Johnson Space Center and Space Center Houston really wanted to take this room back to how it looked when Mission Control was getting men to the moon. So they worked with local architecture firm Stern and Buchek to refurbish every element of this. And I'm showing you this not only because it's a great project, but also because this is a 100% restoration, and it's kind of rare that you see that. They went back to original furniture manufacturers and looked at fabric samples. They settled on what was modern equivalents of 1960s upholstery to reupholster office chairs. At the bottom, the ceiling tiles that were in Mission Control originally had a pattern of holes punched into them for acoustical purposes. And those tiles didn't exist. They had been taken out long ago. But the restoration team found a remnant of one of these tiles in a phone booth, and they were able to scan the pattern of holes into a computer and then use the computer to punch holes into new ceiling tiles. So it's a little bit hard to see, but that bottom right picture, that's the fragment of historic ceiling tile on the left, and then a fragment of new ceiling tile on the right with the same hole pattern punched into it. They also went to eBay and Etsy and places like that and bought vintage binders and ashtrays and coffee cups and headsets and pens and pencils because they wanted it to look like the Apollo mission control crew had just gotten up and left the room. And in fact, that's how it looks. It's open for tours again, but the room looks as close to 1969 as they could get it, which I think is just wonderful. I wanted to wrap up here by saying, you know, even though there has been preservation done, there are still things that we've lost that I wish we had. And it's again, kind of a reminder of some of the things that could have been saved if we had, you know, had a different mindset years ago. Houses like this, this was the Levy Mansion on Main Street, just south of where, of what we now think of as downtown. It was in a neighborhood called the South End, which was a really fashionable neighborhood in the early 20th century. If any of you remember or have heard of Levy's department store, this was the Levy family that built and owned this house. It was two brothers and a sister, none of them married, and the sister, Harriet Levy, was the last one living. And she saw what was happening to the houses in her neighborhood. She saw that they were either being knocked down or they were being turned into apartments or just getting run down. And she couldn't bear to think of that happening to her house. So she put it in her will that when she died, the house would be demolished. And so that's what happened in the late 1930s. So a story that probably couldn't have been avoided with preservation, but it's a reminder of the fact that it used to be that when you drove out of downtown on Main Street, you would pass block after block after block of houses like this. Here's a couple more that used to exist on the street, and none of these stand today. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we had one of them even, but unfortunately not. We also had some great movie theaters once upon a time, and some of you may remember these. The Lowe's State is the one that's shown here on Main Street, designed in kind of a French Renaissance style with crystal chandeliers and a big dome in the auditorium with a big central chandelier. It was from the era of the movie palace when the theater companies were building these really extravagant movie theaters where going to the movie was a real experience. On the left is a picture of one of the lobbies of the Lowe's State. And one of the most amazing things from my standpoint, because I never experienced theaters like this, the furnishings in the lobby look like French antiques, and that's because they are French antiques. The theater company bought all the furniture from one of the Vanderbilt mansions in New York and brought it down and used it to furnish the lobbies of the theater. So it's just hard to imagine going to a movie and walking past French vases and antique French mirrors, but that was the experience you had. Right next door to the Lowe's State was the Metropolitan, which was designed to look like you were seeing a movie in King Tut's tomb. It was Art Deco Egyptian kind of fantasy architecture, but really colorful and really elaborate. And then if you went a couple of blocks up and a couple of blocks over, you could see a movie at the Majestic, which was meant to look like you were sitting in an Italian courtyard with balconies and greenery and statues. We had these three beautiful downtown movie theaters, and we demolished all of them within the space of 18 months for parking. And again, if we had kept one of them, think of what a treasure it would be, but we didn't. And another building that you may remember, the Shamrock Hotel. Probably not ever the most beautiful building in town, but it was definitely one of the most famous. The largest hotel in Houston when it opened in 1949. It kind of was the epitome of the like mid-century Texas oil boom hotel. Really extravagant with shops and supper clubs and restaurants, and of course, swimming pool, which was one of its big claims to fame. The pool was the largest outdoor pool, I believe, in the world when the hotel opened, big enough to have a synchronized swimming team at the top and water skiing at the same time, sometimes in the same pool. The hotel started to kind of fall on hard times, especially as like the Galleria was developed in places where there were newer, nicer hotels. People didn't really want to stay out by the medical center when they had the option of staying downtown or kind of on the west side. And eventually the medical center purchased the hotel and said, well, there's really nothing we can do with this old building. So they tore it down in the late 1980s. There was a lot of objection to that. A lot of people really did not want to see the Shamrock go. And I think one of the big ironies of this is now they're building a lot of big hotels around the medical center. So if this had held on for a few years, I think it might still be standing. But you got to remember the late 80s was right in the middle of the oil bust, and it was just hard to justify keeping a building of this size that wasn't making money sitting there at the time. So it was demolished for parking again, and I believe they have finally built on the site. So there is a new building now, I think, where the Shamrock used to be. There are some projects that we're keeping an eye on because preservation is a moving target. We have successes, but we still have buildings that we're worried about. The River Oaks Theater is one, the oldest movie theater in Houston that's still showing movies, dates from 1938, 39. You may have read in the paper over the last few years that the owners of the River Oaks Shopping Center have a long-term plan to redevelop the entire site with new buildings and high rises and things like that. The theater is not currently in danger, but we feel like it will be at some point. And so we're going to do what we can to try to encourage the developers to retain it. I mean, if you wanted to build a high-rise apartment building on the site, keep the theater in the bottom of the apartment building, because no other apartment building in Houston would have an Art Deco theater downstairs where the residents could go watch movies. There's so many things you can do if you're just creative. Tranquility Park downtown, which does not look like this if you go there today, because it really hasn't been kept up well. But Tranquility Park it's one of our least appreciated public spaces, but it's really important because it was Houston's official commemoration of the moon landing. And the fountains that you see in this picture were designed to look like parts of the rockets that took men to the moon back in 1969. This fountain has not been well maintained over the years. The fashion for downtown parks has really changed, and it's less kind of a hard-edged park like Tranquility Park, and people want something that's kind of more grassy and friendly like Discovery Green, which I can totally get behind. The thing is, we just don't want to see all the important historic elements of Tranquility Park swept away. So again, when the time comes for the Parks Department to potentially redevelop this, we're going to try to work with them to save some of the defining characteristics of the park while potentially improving other areas of the park. And the Kirby Mansion, this is one that's been in the news here in the last couple of years. This is right in Midtown, just south of the Pierce Elevated, the last one of those big South End houses that has survived. It was once the home of lumber baron John Henry Kirby, and then became, I think, the local headquarters of the Red Cross. It was a law office for many years, and it changed hands a few years ago, and the new owner announced plans to demolish it. Luckily, he didn't get around to doing so, and we're still working with the new owner and potential new developers to try to find a way to save this building. The thing about the Kirby Mansion is it's a big house, but it only sits on a fragment of its block. So you could build around it, and you could save the mansion as part of a new hotel or, again, apartment building or whatever somebody wanted to build there. But this is one of those things that, again, no other hotel in town, no other apartment building in town would have a beautiful Tudor-style mansion as its entrance and maybe, amenity rooms for tenants or whatever. So there are definitely still preservation fights that we're planning for, and it's never a story that's completely done, but we're finding new reasons to be encouraged all the time, because even though Houston loses a lot of history every day, we're saving more than we ever have. So I appreciate you paying attention to this, and I will see, let's see, I can stop sharing, and then Jeff, however you want to handle questions, I'm happy to do if anybody wants to ask anything.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, I guess raise your hand or just, I think you can take yourself off mute, I think. I do want to say I live at 2016 Main, and I think that's where the Levy House was.
It is.
So I actually saw that exact photo in our lobby because they redid our lobby, and we're trying to show the history of our building. So I thought that was really interesting. I've actually done one of your walking tours. It was a few years ago. Very interesting. I grew up in Pearland, so I was always coming to the city as fast as I could by myself. But yeah, just learning about the city and the architecture. And I do remember I think it was like 1988, 89 when we had that Rendezvous Houston with Jean-Michel Jarre, the French musician, synthesizer player guy, where we had the fireworks coming off of the top of the buildings and all that stuff. So I thought that was really cool, and actually talked to the docent that day about it a little bit. So I think I kind of surprised him that I was kind of showing my age, but
I remember Rendezvous Houston too. That was really cool.
Yeah. I was lucky enough. My mom worked at NASA during that time. She worked at NASA for 40 years before she retired. So I got like a special recording of the concert and all that kind of good stuff. So especially seeing the Johnson Space, the mission control, that was really fun to see too. But just kind of piggybacking on what you were saying, Jim, we are a city that tears everything down, unfortunately. And I think that's kind of sad because we lose our history with that.
Yeah, we do. And that's, people will ask us from time to time, like, why do you think it's important to save these buildings? And it's because, I mean, you can tell history and you can write history down, but being able to stand in mission control, as an example, you could never describe what it's like to be in that space. And if that space is gone, you can never recreate it. So, but we just try to encourage Houston not to tear everything down.
Right.
What about the Astrodome?
Oh, why did you ask me that? The Astrodome, though, that's a really good question. So the Astrodome is a long and winding road. If you followed it through the news for the last, gosh, what has it been, 10 or 15 years, you remember that the county came up with a proposal back a few years ago to have a bond issue, I think, to convert the building into kind of a convention center. There was a referendum on that, and that did not get approved. There was a misunderstanding among a lot of voters. They thought that by voting yes, it would get converted to a convention center, and by voting no, it would get demolished. And it was never that. It was either fix it up or don't fix it up. The building is actually protected at the state level, so it can't be demolished. But no one has quite figured out what to do with it. You may remember also that Ed Emmett, our previous county judge, was really kind of devoted to trying to reactivate the Astrodome, and he had a plan to build parking in basically the basement of the building, which would get some revenue generated and then might attract a developer to do something with the actual dome part of the building. And then our county administration changed, and I think it's fair to say Judge Hidalgo has had other things on her plate in the last year. So, we're still hopeful. That the good thing is, I guess, the building is not going anywhere because it does have protections on it. But there are smart people who are still trying to figure out how to make it work for us. And I think the important thing about the Astrodome is it's a building that we own, that Harris County residents own, that's paid for. And, it's another case of, beyond its importance to Houston history, why tear down a building that we could use? I think what Preservation Houston has advocated for all along is put it to use, make it a convention center, make it an indoor amusement park, whatever it is. But it's a building that should be working for us. And it's a symbol of Houston, just like NASA is. It's a building that I would really hate for us to lose.
I had a question in the chat. They wanted to know why buildings would catch on fire so much back in the early days.
That's a good question. They did a lot. So there's multiple reasons. buildings were made out of flammable materials. That's one. People used, well, they smoked for one thing. So, I mean, it was easy to like flick a cigarette and catch something on fire, but also they used like wood burning and coal burning stoves to heat their buildings. And those were very flammable. They didn't have, I guess, like the plumbing or connections or whatever you want to say. So like if you had a stove, you might end up with like a buildup of gas, or if you had a gas line that came into your house, there were various reasons. Also, we didn't have sprinklers back then. So commercial buildings, if they caught on fire, there was a good chance they would just go up in flames. And our fire department wasn't very good for a long time. So that was also part of it. They would try, but at various times in Houston's history, we haven't had like a reliable water supply. We haven't had good fire trucks. We haven't had good streets. So there's a lot of reasons for it. But I think the main two things that keep buildings from burning down today is we have a lot more sprinklers and we have fireproof materials and safer heaters and stoves and things like that, luckily. Especially just coming out of a cold snap, because
right.
I kind of suspect that when we had weather like we just had, that's when half the city would burn down.
Jim, Amy Taylor here, and hello, everybody. Good to see you. I've been watching all of you. I have to just mention that we've had some great success stories in this city too. And I do think there's a passion for restoration and revival that didn't seem to exist when I was a child. I'll put it that way. And I'm seeing a whole lot of that. We live on Cortland Place, and there are 17 homes that are in their original historic tradition, if you will. Many families have come in and modernized them and so forth, but we've maintained the good bones for the most part. The one next door to me is a big exception. But the bottom line is there's a whole lot of excitement about restoration on our street. And Robert and I have been here 28 years, and we've been really excited about that because Robert's an architect and he has a real dedication to restoration, renovation, and preservation. So just want to mention that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Jim, Diane here. I'd like to also add that we're the mid-century modern preservation team. So there are quite a few of us that are trying to preserve that time as well. So I think there's a real movement as well. I agree with Amy, but I really wanted to spend a second and thank you for all the work that you all did to help us with the chapel. Our chapel at Holly Hall was a little hidden jewel that no one knew about. It was just sitting there. So we really appreciate all your help and support to get us where we need to be. And thank you.
Well, you're welcome. We were so excited when that, that was really one that I guess you'd say just kind of came over the transom from our perspective. And we're so excited when, I mean, it was a building that we didn't know existed, and it's beautiful. And we were just so excited to know about it and excited to be able to help. And I should mention, I did mention Houston Mod, the other organization that we worked with on that. Houston Mod is a group that's dedicated specifically to the preservation of mid-century buildings, and we work hand in hand with them, and they're fantastic. But I think back to Amy's point, there is a growing awareness of our historic architecture and kind of people feeling like this is important. And I would say, even 10 years ago or 20 years ago, you didn't have kind of the attitude that you have now. So it may be a sign that Houston is growing up, or that we're just getting sentimental, or I don't know what it is, but in Go Houston, we have suddenly figured out a way that we don't have to steamroll over everything.
Yeah, I think also, with I lived in Montrose before I ended up in at 2016. I think me personally, I think the whole gentrification of Montrose has really changed my perspective on preservation and keeping historical things. I read an article in Texas Monthly probably a couple of weeks ago about how Montrose has changed. And they said, is it Montrose that has changed, or is it yourself that has changed? But you want to go back to those younger days when you were in your 20s and, going out, roaming the streets and everything. So, it really opened my eyes once I moved out of Montrose and just kind of saw like a year later how much it had changed with the apartment buildings going up. And do you think any of like the no zoning laws around here, do you think that has a lot to do with things getting torn down and people are just like, I'm just going to put this apartment building up because, you know, we can make a lot of money and
Oh,
who
yeah,
cares
well,
about history and
1000%. I mean, the lack of zoning, and I know that it's an un-Houstonian thing to do to wish for zoning, but the lack of zoning is really the thing that's resulted in a lot of the things that people complain about Houston. You know, when you hear people talk about, oh, you drive down the street and it's a mess because you have a skyscraper next to a strip mall, next to a church, next to a whatever. It's because we don't have zoning. And it's always interesting to me to hear people compare Houston and Dallas. And I mean, that's a rabbit hole we don't need to go down. But one of the things people will say about Dallas is, oh, it's so like clean and orderly and boring. Well, I think you're seeing the result of zoning, and it's supposed to be that way. It's not necessarily bad, but from a preservation standpoint, you know, what we do see in some historic neighborhoods, I'll use Cortland Place as an example. Cortland Place is this beautiful jewel that's, you know, protected and all this, but it's on the north side of Cortland Place. It backs up to Westheimer, and there are all kinds of weird buildings and shopping centers and stuff that are right over maybe Amy's back fence. So in Houston,
They are.
you just never know what's going to be built next to you, and that's part of the argument for preservation. Is you know, if you live in Norhill, or if you live in Cortland Place, or if you live in Westmoreland or wherever, and you don't want to see that happen to your neighborhood, getting a historic district declared is a good way to kind of make sure that you don't have a random 40-story apartment building built right down the street from your house.
right.
But
I can tell you, I can tell you 28 years ago, there was a strip joint behind our house. Across the street was an adult bookstore, video store. It was not unusual to see people of all walks of life walking the streets, if you know what I mean. And we're very grateful that good restaurants have moved in and you know, we can walk to dinner and things like that. But boy, we checked the crime reports before we bought.
yeah, it's a hodgepodge. And you know, I will say the other side of that coin is, I mean, Houston is strange and weird. And when you drive around and you see all these unexpected things, that's kind of part of what makes Houston wonderful. May not make it a wonderful block by block to live, but you know, it's a trade-off. So, but the zoning question definitely makes it more of a challenge to maintain.
Jim, don't you think that there's a real resurgence in I'm going to use the term neighborhood, you know, walkability, where you can really live in your neighborhood. And I think part of that will help preservation, because people don't want the character of their neighborhoods to change as much as we used to. People would just move in, move out. They didn't care. But people seem to be more settled in a neighborhood, or they look for a neighborhood more. And I think that's helping preservation across the board.
I agree. I think you're right about that. It's that loss of character that worries people sometimes, because I'm not picking on Katy, but there are neighborhoods that you can go drive through in Katy that are new, nice suburban neighborhoods, but you could be anywhere in the country driving through one of those neighborhoods. There's nothing to distinguish it to say that you're in Houston. But if you go to parts of Montrose, you feel like you're in parts of the Heights, you feel like you're in Houston. So I think people like that character. People like the walkability, as you say. And I do think with COVID, that's on more people's minds, because I mean, we've all been at home and we haven't been able to drive across town to do whatever we want to do. So I think people are thinking more about that. So, you know, if there's a bright spot to come out of the pandemic, that may be part of it, is people refocus on their houses and their neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah, and going back to the walkability thing, I keep talking about my area because I live down the street from the Kirby Mansion. That when I walk down to Midtown to pick up my ramen or my Mexican food at Cyclone Anaya's, like I'll walk by it. And it's a beautiful home. I believe the Boy Scouts of America used to be
Yeah.
That may be right.
or something,
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
local
they were.
chapter.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, with more people, with the pandemic, people have been kind of in their area, their circle around their home. So they're walking and they're seeing and I've always known this, the more you walk, the more you see, where if you're driving, driving fast, you miss everything. So yeah, walking by that Kirby Mansion, it's a beautiful, beautiful home. I sure hope that they can save it and, like you said, build it up and have an amenity or something.
Well, I hope so too. I'm curious if I can ask everybody something, and just to raise your hands, how many of y'all are from Houston?
Suburbs or Houston?
You can be suburbs too, but only a couple. Okay. Let me ask you this. I'm not going to ask you to date yourselves, but how many of you can remember going to the downtown movie theaters? Maybe that's a better question. Okay, a couple. So, all right, a few. All right. I wish that I could. I would love to be able to go to one of those, but
Yeah.
because I'll tell you, movie theaters now are just not the same. I mean, I'd be willing to put up with sticky floors and a smell of popcorn if I was sitting in a beautiful Egyptian movie theater.
Right. Sarah Ballantyne, what was the motivation behind renovating the Julia Idison building, and who did that? The library?
So the motivation behind it was, it's a gorgeous piece of architecture, and they thought that it should be a kind of a civic showplace. It was done through. It was one of those where there were multiple groups involved. So the city and the library system were involved, but there was also a private group that did the actual fundraising for it, called, I think, maybe the Julia Idison Friends or something like that. And I'm sorry?
It was Friends of Idison, I think.
Friends of Idison, yeah.
Yeah.
And part of what they did, Sarah, is, there's the newer library building next door, which was filling most of the library functions, and the Idison building had gotten kind of cramped and overcrowded with what was in it. So they were able to use part of the money to build the new wing that's the up-to-date, technologically advanced archival wing, and it freed up the spaces in the original building for, an event room and an art gallery and things like that. So what I like about it is you can actually go and appreciate the architecture more than you used to be able to.
Yeah.
Because I love the Texas Room, the Houston Metropolitan Research Center, but when it was in its old home in the old reading room, you couldn't see anything because it was just chock full of stuff. And now you can walk in that room and you can see all the beautiful carvings and everything. So
When I first came to Houston, I was involved in a research project that was housed in that old room when it was just chock-a-block with stuff, and you couldn't find anything in it. But the floors are exquisite. Everything is just a beautiful, beautiful space.
oh, it's gorgeous. The Idison building and the old county courthouse were both restored about the same time, and they're both just incredible. And I'm so glad we have them and that we can go and enjoy them.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome. And Diana says in the chat that her only protest march was the Save the Shamrock March. Way to go. I like it.
Great.
I have I was thinking about it the other day. I have a little piece of the Shamrock roof that is somewhere in my apartment that may turn up at some point. But
I'm so sorry that I didn't save the Shamrock shirt. It was green with a big shamrock on the front. I don't know what happened to it. I would love to have it.
oh, that's a piece of history now for sure.
Yes.
Well, I'm glad that you marched, and I don't know that anybody could have actually changed their minds and saved the building, but I'm glad you tried, Diana.
It looks like Diane had a question. What is happening to the Heritage Society?
Well, the Heritage Society is, I think they're struggling these days, for a variety of reasons. The Heritage Society, as I mentioned, has done great work with restoring those historic buildings. And when the Heritage Society was organized in the 1950s, people went to house museums. They went to look at old
Right.
homes and things like that. And that has really fallen off over the years. That's just something that the same number of people don't do these days. So I think they've been affected by that. And also, the Heritage Society is kind of in an unusual situation because they're housed at Sam Houston Park and they have those homes, but they're not getting any real support to maintain those buildings. You would think, I think people think, oh, the city pays for that. Well, the city doesn't pay for that. And I will say maintaining a historic building only gets more expensive as time goes by. So they're having, they're strapped for cash like everybody else is. And I don't think that COVID has helped, because I imagine they've had to really cut back on their tours and their in-person events. So they can definitely use all the love and support that we can give them, because they've done tremendous work for the last 60 years or so. So it's hard to be a nonprofit out there these days. I'll tell you, we're feeling it too. And
Yeah.
we're lucky enough that we were on good financial footing when COVID started, but I'll tell you, it hasn't been fun. So.
I know.
Well, I mean, nothing about COVID has been fun, except that I have actually learned to cook. So that's been fun. I haven't killed myself. I wouldn't say it's good. I'm not ready to invite y'all over, but I'm getting there.
Burn the house down.
I haven't burned the house down yet. Yeah.
That's good.
It looks like Sue Gorman had typed something in the chat. We have learned a lot about Houston from Mr. McKinney Historic Bus Tours. Very well done.
Oh, great. That's good.
Yeah, I've seen those buses running around town. It looks like the hop-on, hop-off buses, like in San Francisco. I've always wondered about those. So thank you, Sue, for giving us that feedback on that. Yeah,
there's a number of groups out there that are doing, historical tours and historical talks, and we're lucky enough to have a lot of people in town who are interested in the topic. So you can learn a lot out there.
Yeah, we learned a lot with the Lawndale Cemetery tour about all the
Mr. McKinney.
all the people buried there from the history of Houston. It was fascinating.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's an interesting place for sure.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap up because they're about to start bingo across the way. So I don't know how much you can hear.
They're going to get rowdy over there, right?
Right. But I want to thank you, Jim, very much for your wonderful presentation on the history of Houston and all the architecture. And it was so cool to see the old photos of the city, which just brings joy to my eyes when I see stuff like that, because I like old photos, especially over there. It looked like by La Carafe and Hearsay that you mentioned, Market Square. So yeah, that area has really revitalized. So, and I'm hoping, as we all know, downtown Houston was on the brink of great things before COVID hit. My place to go was downtown. I'd rather go downtown than go into Montrose or Midtown, because that was the place to be with, bars and restaurants. So hopefully, as I mentioned earlier, with everyone getting vaccinated, our city will come back better than ever, and just like with the rest of the country and the rest of the world. So again, Jim, thank you so much. Everyone, thank you for being on the call. And our next Tuesday talk will be on February 16th with HEB. It's going to be Heart Healthy with HEB Nutrition Services. So we'll be discussing heart healthy habits. February is Heart Health Month. And so we want everybody to take care of themselves. So we're going to have HEB here to talk about their services that they provide, which was new to me. Holly Hall, as I said, we are slowly opening up. We are doing tours, in-person tours. However, it's only for the apartments only. I'm not able to show the rest of the community, unfortunately, to show our beautiful chapel. But we do have a virtual tour set up on our website. So if you'd like to just take a look at our grounds, many of you have already been here multiple times. But we do have availability. So if you know of anybody that is ready to make a move into a community, I have some independent living apartments and assisted living apartments available. So I'll be happy to talk to anybody. If y'all have anybody, any loved ones y'all are concerned about, feel free to reach out and I can reach out to them and kind of see where their head's at and everything. So again, thank you, Jim, and thank you for all the great work that Preservation Houston does. And I'm definitely going to take part in your walking tour again here in the near future when the weather starts being really nice during the day.
Right.
So,
Yeah, we'll have that to look forward to. Thanks again, everybody, for listening, and thanks for the great questions. I really appreciate it.
all right. Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you everyone for attending. And I look forward to seeing y'all next time.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Hello, Ms. Carr.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.